They told her to leave. 25 doctors in that room had already given up. Machines screamed. A woman lay convulsing on a bed that cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime. And standing in the doorway was a girl no one should have listened to, a delivery rider with frozen hands, worn shoes, and a torn canvas bag. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't family. She didn't belong there. But then she said something that made the entire room go silent. "You're not saving her. You're killing her." If she was wrong, she would be arrested before sunrise. If she was right, a powerful empire would owe its future to a girl who had nothing. What no one in that room knew was this: she almost walked away. And the reason she didn't had nothing to do with the woman on that bed. Vivian slowed her bicycle to a stop in front of the Blackwood estate, just as the winter wind cut through her coat and into her bones. December mornings always felt cruel, but this one seemed determined to remind her of exactly where she stood in the world. The iron gates rose high above her, black and cold, guarding a mansion worth more money than she could earn in 10 lifetimes. She glanced down at the order slip clipped to her handlebars, 20 cups of coffee. Every Tuesday without fail. It was simple work, familiar work. Ride in, deliver, leave quietly. She rang the bell once. Then again, no footsteps came, no door opened. After a few minutes, she sighed, tightening her scarf as she prepared to leave the cups by the steps and pedal toward her next job. That was when the scream tore through the air. It wasn't the sharp cry of annoyance or anger. It was raw, desperate, the sound of someone losing control of the world they depended on. Vivian froze. The sound came from above, from behind the tall second-floor windows that reflected the pale winter sky. Slowly, she looked up. Through the glass, she saw chaos unfold like a nightmare she hadn't asked to witness. Doctors in white coats rushed back and forth. Machines screamed and flashed. And at the center of it all, an elderly woman lay on a massive bed, her body convulsing violently as if something unseen was tearing her apart from the inside. Vivian's fingers tightened around the handlebars. She had no business seeing this, no business standing here. And yet, something rooted her to the spot. Then it reached her, not the sound, not the sight, but the smell. Her breath caught as the air filled her lungs. It wasn't antiseptic. It wasn't medicine. It was sweet and floral. But wrong. Too sweet. Too clean. Artificial in a way that made the back of her throat burn. Not real flowers, but an imitation of them, laced with chemicals that clung to her senses. Her heart stuttered painfully. 3 years ago, in a cramped apartment that smelled of boiled herbs and old wood, she had smelled that same scent. She remembered the way Mrs. Jenkins from down the hall had collapsed onto the couch, her limbs jerking uncontrollably, her lips turning blue while everyone panicked. She remembered her grandmother, Nana Ruth, moving with calm certainty, throwing open the windows, forcing fresh air inside, mixing herbs with steady hands while others screamed for ambulances. Vivian had watched, wide-eyed, as life returned where death had seemed inevitable. That memory crashed into her now, sharp and uninvited. She stepped closer to the gate before she could stop herself. And then she stopped. The world narrowed to a single, unbearable thought. Hazel, her 14-year-old sister, sitting at their tiny kitchen table the night before, coughing softly between breaths as she tried to finish her homework. Hazel's smile, brave and fragile all at once. The doctor's voice still echoed in Vivian's head, low and clinical, as if discussing the weather instead of a child's life. If the surgery isn't done soon, she may not survive the winter. $85,000. An impossible number. Vivian had worked 3 jobs, skipped meals, counted every coin for nearly a decade. And she still wasn't even halfway there. Her chest tightened until it hurt to breathe. If she stepped inside that mansion, if she interfered, if she was wrong, everything could collapse. Police, lawsuits, prison, Hazel alone in a hospital room, waiting for a sister who would never come back. Vivian's feet felt heavy, as if the frozen ground had claimed her. She could walk away. She should walk away. This wasn't her world. These weren't her people. The woman on that bed had doctors, 25 of them, by the look of it. The best money could buy. Who was Vivian to think she knew better? Another scream rose from inside, weaker this time, fraying at the edges like a candle flame about to go out. Vivian closed her eyes. She imagined Hazel's small hand slipping from hers. She imagined the guilt that would follow her for the rest of her life if she turned away now. When she opened her eyes again, her decision was already made, even if fear screamed against it. She pushed her bicycle aside and moved toward the gate, her heart pounding so hard it felt as though it might burst. Every step forward felt like betrayal of common sense, of survival, of the quiet life she was desperately trying to hold together. Yet something deeper pulled her on, something Nana Ruth had once told her in a voice softened by years and wisdom. If you know how to stop suffering and you choose not to, that choice becomes yours to carry. Vivian reached the gate and wrapped her fingers around the cold iron. In that moment, she understood the cruel twist of fate unfolding around her. She wasn't here to save a wealthy stranger. She wasn't here to prove anything. She was here because walking away would mean accepting a world where lives were decided by money and titles alone. And she could not live in that world, not after everything she had already lost. Inside the mansion, machines continued to scream. Outside, the cold deepened. Vivian took a breath, steadying herself as best she could, knowing that once she crossed this threshold, there would be no turning back. Whether she saved a life or destroyed her own, the choice was already made. If this story touched your heart, follow the channel to enjoy many more heart-stirring stories every week. The iron gate did not open quietly. Its low mechanical groan echoed through the frozen morning as Vivian slipped inside the Blackwood estate, her breath fogging in short, shallow bursts. Gravel crunched beneath her worn sneakers, the sound absurdly loud against the vast silence of the grounds. She took 3 steps forward before a shadow detached itself from the side of the mansion and moved to block her path. He was tall, broad, immovable, dressed in a dark coat that looked as rigid as his posture. His eyes swept over her with practiced efficiency, lingering just long enough to measure her worth and dismiss it. "Delivery entrance is in the back," he said, voice flat. Already turning away, Vivian didn't move. The scream from upstairs rang again, thinner now, threaded with panic, her hands curled into fists at her sides. "There's a woman dying in there," she said. "The Man-Stone." She would later learn turned slowly, irritation flickering across his face. "The family has doctors," he replied. "You don't belong here." The words struck harder than the cold. Vivian knew that tone. She had heard it from landlords, managers, strangers who glanced at her clothes and decided the limits of her life in a single look. Still, she stepped forward, her voice trembling but steady. "They're not helping her. Something's wrong with the air." Stone's gaze sharpened, skepticism hardening into disdain. "That's enough. Leave now, before I call the police." Vivian's heart slammed against her ribs. This was the moment she had feared. The moment when reality demanded she retreat. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, to grab her bicycle and disappear into the city where she belonged. But then she smelled it again, stronger now as the wind shifted the same cloying, synthetic sweetness that haunted her memory. Without thinking, she reached into her canvas bag and pulled it open, revealing the packets of dried herbs, the small glass bottles worn smooth with age. "My grandmother treated this before," she said quickly. "The symptoms match. Convulsions, shallow breathing, blue lips. It's poisoning." Stone stared at the bag as if it were an insult. "Herbs?" he scoffed. "You expect me to let you into this house with leaves and stories?" Heat rushed to Vivian's face, humiliation and fear tangling in her chest. "I know how it sounds," she said, swallowing hard. "But if I'm wrong, you can arrest me. Just let me try." Stone lifted his wrist, his finger hovering over the call button on his radio. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Vivian held his gaze, refusing to look away, even as her knees threatened to buckle. In his eyes, she saw calculation, not cruelty, the careful weighing of risk that came with guarding a powerful family. Then hurried footsteps thundered from the front door. Another guard burst out, his face drained of color. "Stone," he gasped. "The doctors say she's crashing. They've done everything. Mr. Blackwood? He's losing it." The words landed like a blow. Stone's jaw tightened as he glanced between Vivian and the man behind him. For the first time, doubt flickered across his features. Not doubt in her, but doubt in the certainty he had clung to until now. Vivian seized the moment. "Please," she whispered. "If you do nothing, she dies." Another scream echoed from above, barely audible, more breath than sound. Stone closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, then lowered his radio. "What's your name, Vivian?" she answered. "Vivian Cross." He studied her again, more carefully this time, as if trying to see past the frayed edges and exhaustion. Whatever he saw made him step aside. "One mistake," he warned. "One, and I'd drag you out myself." Relief flooded her so fast it made her dizzy. Vivian slipped past him, the weight of what she'd just done crashing down all at once. The mansion doors loomed ahead, tall and imposing, as if daring her to cross another line she could never uncross. She reached for the handle and froze. A presence filled the space behind her, heavy and unmistakable. "What's going on here?" The voice was low, rough with strain, carrying an authority that demanded attention without effort. Vivian turned slowly. At the top of the marble staircase stood a man dressed in black, his posture rigid, his features carved sharp by exhaustion and fury. Even from a distance, she could feel the gravity of him, the way everyone else seemed to orbit around his existence. His gray eyes locked onto hers, cold and searching, and for a moment the world narrowed to the space between them. This was Cassian Blackwood. And as Vivian met his gaze, she realized with a jolt that whatever happened next would change both their lives in ways neither of them could yet imagine. Cassian Blackwood did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The moment he descended the first step of the staircase, the entire foyer seemed to contract around him, as if the air itself recognized authority. Vivian felt it immediately, the subtle pressure in her chest, the instinctive urge to lower her gaze. She resisted it. Her hands tightened around the strap of her canvas bag, anchoring herself to the only certainty she had left. Cassian stopped 3 steps above her, close enough that she could see the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the faint tremor in the hand resting on the banister. He looked nothing like the untouchable titan whispered about in the city's darker corners. He looked like a man who had been fighting time and losing. "Stone," he said quietly. "Why is there a stranger in my house?" Stone straightened, words tumbling out in careful order, explaining the convulsions, the doctor's failure, the girl who claimed to know something no one else did. Cassian's gaze never left Vivian. It weighed her, stripped her down to intention and nerve. "You," he said at last. "Speak." The command landed with terrifying simplicity. Vivian's throat went dry, but she forced herself to breathe. "It's not a seizure," she said. "Not the kind they're treating. Something in the room is poisoning her." A murmur rippled through the space behind Cassian guards, staff, all bristling at the audacity. Cassian lifted a hand, silencing them without looking back. And you know this, how his tone was flat, skeptical, but beneath it lay a fracture hope's dangerous cousin. Vivian swallowed. "I smelled it from outside. Synthetic floral oil. It triggers convulsions in people who can't metabolize the compounds. It builds up in sealed, heated rooms." She paused, choosing honesty over polish. "My grandmother treated a case like this. I watched her." Cassian studied her face, searching for cracks, greed, fear, calculation. He found none. What he saw unsettled him more. There was terror. Yes, but it was braided with resolve, the kind that came from knowing exactly what failure would cost. "You understand," he said slowly, "that if you're wrong, there will be consequences." Vivian nodded once. "I understand." He turned toward the staircase, then stopped. Why risk it? The question was not rhetorical. Vivian hesitated, the image of Hazel's pale smile flickering through her mind. She could lie. She didn't, because if I walk away, she said quietly, I won't survive the person I become. The words settled between them, stark and intimate. Cassian felt something shift, a recognition he hadn't expected. Without another word, he motioned for her to follow. They climbed the stairs together, the distance between them charged with unspoken stakes. The bedroom doors opened onto a controlled storm. White coats crowded the space, alarms shrilled, and the scent hit Vivian like a wall. Sweet, suffocating, wrong. On the bed lay Margaret Blackwood, her body jerking violently, lips tinged blue. Cassian moved to her side, all restraint cracking as he took her hand. "Mother," he whispered, the word rough with helplessness. Doctor? Moore turned sharply, her authority snapping into place. Mr. Blackwood? Who is this? Cassian straightened, steel returning to his spine. Someone who may know what you don't. The doctor's eyes flicked to Vivian with open contempt. This is reckless. Vivian stepped forward despite the weight of their stares. She went straight to the diffuser in the corner, watching the mist curl endlessly into trapped air. Turn it off, she said. Open the windows. Laughter thin, incredulous, broke from one of the doctors. Doctor, Moore's voice cut through it. Absolutely not. The patient is unstable. Cold air will send her into shock. Vivian didn't argue. She looked at Cassian. Every minute that stays on, she said softly, the poison deepens. Cassian closed his eyes for a heartbeat. 6 hours. 6 hours of watching the best fail. He opened them and made his choice. Do it, he said. Doctor... Moore stared, stunned. You can't, I can. Cassian replied, ice hard. Guards moved instantly. Windows flew open. Cold December air surged in, scattering papers, rattling equipment. The diffuser was switched off. The room held its breath. Vivian knelt, her fear dissolving into focus as she unpacked her herbs with reverent speed. Cassian watched her hands steady, gentle as she worked beside his mother. For the first time that day, hope did not feel like a lie. Cold air poured into the bedroom like an accusation. The heavy velvet curtains shuddered as the windows were thrown open, and the sharp December wind swept through the space, scattering the artificial sweetness that had saturated the air moments before. Several doctors recoiled instinctively, hands tightening around clipboards, coats pulled closer to their bodies. Vivian felt the chill bite into her skin, but she welcomed it. Clean air always felt honest. She knelt beside the bed, her movements deliberate, almost reverent, as if the room had narrowed to nothing but the woman fighting for breath before her. Margaret Blackwood's convulsions were still violent, but there was a subtle shift now, a hesitation, as though her body had been given a fraction of relief it hadn't known how to ask for. Vivian opened her canvas bag and began laying out the contents with care: dried peppermint leaves, thin slices of ginger wrapped in cloth, a small amber bottle worn smooth by time. Each item carried the quiet weight of memory. She could hear her grandmother's voice in her mind, steady and patient, reminding her that panic was the enemy of healing. Around her, the doctors watched in disbelief. Some whispered, others stared openly, curiosity warring with disdain. Doctor. Moore stood rigid near the foot of the bed, her lips pressed into a thin line. This is madness, she said sharply. You're endangering a patient already on the edge. Vivian did not look up. She's been on the edge for hours, she replied softly. Doing nothing differently would end her. Cassian stood at his mother's side, his hand still clasped around hers. He could feel the cold seep into his bones, but he didn't move. His gaze followed Vivian's every action, drawn to the calm that surrounded her like a shield. There was something almost intimate about the way she worked, a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the chaos of machines and raised voices. For the first time since the morning began, his breathing slowed. Vivian asked for warm water. A young nurse hesitated, glancing toward Dr. Moore, then toward Cassian. At his slight nod, she moved quickly to comply. Vivian soaked a clean cloth, wrung it out, and layered the herbs carefully before placing it over Margaret's chest. The scent that rose was subtle, real, grounded nothing like the suffocating perfume that had poisoned the room. She dabbed a drop of oil beneath Margaret's nose, murmuring words meant more for herself than for anyone else. Breathe, she whispered. Just breathe. Dr. Moore took a step forward, anger flashing in her eyes. You have no right to touch her, she snapped. This woman is not your experiment. Vivian finally looked up, her gaze steady. She's not yours either, she said quietly. The words landed harder than a shout. Cassian felt them echo inside him, stirring something raw. Dr. Moore opened her mouth to argue, but a sudden spike in the monitor cut her off. Alarms shrilled again, louder this time, and the room surged back into motion. Margaret's body arched, a violent convulsion ripping through her frame. Cassian tightened his grip on her hand, fear clawing up his throat. "Do something!" Someone shouted. Vivian did not flinch. She adjusted the cloth, checked Margaret's breathing, her focus absolute. Inside, panic threatened to tear through her composure. She had expected resistance, skepticism, but this, the moment where it could all collapse, felt unbearable. Hazel's face flashed before her eyes, pale and determined, trusting Vivian to come back every night. "If I'm wrong," she thought, "everything ends here." The convulsions slowed, then surged again. Seconds stretched into eternity. Sweat beaded along Vivian's spine despite the cold. Moore watched, arms crossed, a grim satisfaction flickering behind her professional mask, as though she were counting down to failure. "This proves nothing," she said coldly. "You're prolonging the inevitable." Cassian turned toward her, his voice low and dangerous. "You will not speak like that again." Silence fell. Vivian became aware of his presence then, not looming, not oppressive, but grounding. She felt the weight of his faith, fragile and absolute, resting on her shoulders. It steadied her. She remembered Nana Ruth's hands guiding hers, remembered the lesson whispered over steaming pots of herbs. The body wants to live. Sometimes it just needs space. Vivian straightened slightly and spoke with quiet authority. "Give her time," she said. "Her body is fighting the poison. It has to clear." Minutes passed. 5, 10. The room seemed suspended between breaths. Then, almost imperceptibly, Margaret's convulsions lessened. The jerking slowed, softened, until her body sank back against the mattress. The alarms changed tone, their frantic pitch easing into something steadier. One doctor leaned closer to the monitor, his brow furrowing. "Her heart rate is dropping," he said. "Stabilizing." A ripple of shock moved through the room. "Doctor..." Moore's face drained of color. Cassian stared at the screen, afraid to believe what he was seeing. Vivian exhaled shakily, the tension finally cracking. She pressed her fingers lightly against Margaret's wrist, feeling the faint, steady pulse beneath fragile skin. Relief flooded her so fiercely her vision blurred. Cassian's hand tightened around his mother's, emotion surging up with painful force. He looked at Vivian not as a stranger, not as a risk, but as the woman who had stepped into his darkest hour and refused to retreat. In that moment, something irrevocable shifted between them, an invisible thread drawn taut by shared fear and fragile hope. The room no longer judged her. It waited. No one spoke at first. The monitors continued their steady rhythm, softer now, less frantic, as if the room itself were learning how to breathe again. Vivian remained kneeling by the bed, her fingers resting lightly against Margaret Blackwood's wrist, counting the pulse she had feared might disappear forever. It was weak, but it was there, real, alive. Her shoulders trembled once, a small betrayal of the storm she had been holding back. Then she forced herself still. This was not the moment to collapse. This was the moment to endure. Cassian stood beside her, unmoving, his gaze fixed on his mother's face as color slowly returned to skin that had been drained of it minutes earlier. The relief he felt was sharp enough to hurt, slicing through the numb panic that had gripped him all morning. He had built empires without blinking, destroyed enemies without hesitation. But standing here, watching a delivery girl with a torn bag hold his world together, left him strangely unarmed. "Dr. Moore was the first to recover her voice. "This doesn't prove causation," she said tightly, stepping forward. "Spontaneous stabilization can occur. We should resume standard protocol immediately." Vivian lifted her head. "If you reintroduce the toxin," she said calmly, "she will crash again." The certainty in her voice unsettled more than any argument could have. A younger doctor glanced at the diffuser, then at the open windows, doubt flickering across his face. Another checked the readings again, his brow furrowing deeper. Cassian felt the room tilt on a knife's edge. Authority was slipping from hands long used to holding it, and everyone felt it. He turned to Dr. Moore, his voice controlled but lethal. "You had 6 hours," he said. 6 hours to save her." "Dr." Moore bristled. "Medicine is not a guarantee," she snapped. "What you're allowing now is superstition." Cassian didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. What I allowed, he said, was the only thing that worked. The silence that followed was absolute. Dr. Moore stared at him, disbelief hardening into something colder. If anything happens, she warned, this responsibility is yours. Cassian met her gaze without flinching. I know. He turned away from her, the decision already made, and looked down at Vivian. For the first time, he truly saw how young she was beneath the exhaustion, how fragile the lines of her life must be to have carried her here. What happens next? He asked quietly. The question was not a challenge. It was an offering of trust. Vivian drew a slow breath. We wait, she said, and we don't interfere. She rose carefully, her knees stiff, and stepped back just enough to give Margaret space. The room obeyed her without realizing it, bodies shifting, voices lowering. Even Dr. Moore retreated to the far side of the room, her authority diminished by the steady beeping of the monitors. Minutes passed. Then more. Vivian stood near the foot of the bed, her hands clasped tightly together to keep them from shaking. Now that the immediate danger had passed, fear rushed back in with vicious clarity. She thought of Hazel, of hospital corridors and whispered diagnoses, of what would happen if this went wrong after all. Cassian sensed the change in her, the subtle way her spine stiffened, the way her gaze drifted inward. You're not alone, he said softly. The words surprised them both. Vivian looked up, caught off guard by the gentleness in his voice. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition born not of attraction, but of shared vulnerability. Two people standing on opposite ends of the world, bound together by the thin thread of a single life hanging in balance. A nurse approached cautiously. Her vitals are holding, she murmured. Stable? The word echoed like a benediction. Cassian exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding since dawn. He reached down and brushed his thumb over his mother's hand. Reverend. Vivian felt tears sting her eyes and blinked them away. This was not her victory. It was survival. Dr. Moore cleared her throat, regaining some measure of composure. We'll monitor closely, she said. But this changes nothing. Vivian didn't respond. She was watching Margaret's chest rise and fall, watching life assert itself with quiet stubbornness. Cassian turned to her again, studying her face with a new intensity. You took a risk, he said, one that could have destroyed you. Vivian met his gaze, honesty softening her features. Some risks are worse not to take. The simplicity of the truth struck him harder than any plea could have. He nodded once, accepting it. Outside, the winter wind howled against the open windows, but inside the room, something had irrevocably shifted. The hierarchy that had ruled moments before lay fractured, replaced by an uneasy, fragile balance. Vivian gathered her bag slowly, her movements careful, as though afraid to disturb the delicate peace she had helped create. Cassian watched her, aware with startling clarity that the moment she walked away, the world would never return to what it had been before. The decision he had made placing his mother's life in her hands had sealed more than her fate. It had altered his own. And as Margaret Blackwood breathed on, suspended between danger and recovery, Cassian understood that this was only the beginning of consequences neither of them could yet see. Time lost its shape inside the bedroom. Minutes stretched, thinned, then folded back on themselves as the world outside the windows remained frozen in pre-dawn gray. Vivian stood near the foot of the bed, her attention anchored to every subtle rise and fall of Margaret Blackwood's chest. The crisis had eased, but it had not released them. Survival was fragile here, something that could slip away if watched too carelessly. The monitors hummed with quiet persistence, their rhythm steady enough to inspire hope, unstable enough to deny certainty. Cassian remained by his mother's side, one hand resting against the mattress, as though anchoring her to the world through sheer will. He had stopped warning himself not to hope. That restraint had shattered the moment the numbers on the screen began to settle. Now he allowed the feeling in cautiously, like light creeping through a cracked door. Across the room, Dr. Moore observed from a distance, her expression guarded, pride bruised, but not yet surrendered. She said nothing, but her eyes followed Vivian constantly, searching for weakness. for proof that this calm was an illusion. Vivian felt the weight of that scrutiny, yet she didn't flinch. Instead, she focused inward, steadying her breath the way her grandmother had taught her. Panic was loud. Control was quiet. A nurse moved softly to adjust an IV line, careful not to disturb the stillness that had settled over the room. "Blood pressure is holding," she whispered. The words barely made a ripple, but they landed hard in Vivian's chest. Holding meant not falling. Holding meant a chance. Cassian closed his eyes briefly, his forehead dipping toward his mother's hand. The intimacy of the moment caught him off guard. He had not prayed since childhood, but something in him whispered thanks anyway, not to a god, but to the girl who had stood where no one else dared. Vivian shifted her weight, exhaustion seeping into her limbs now that adrenaline no longer shielded her. She leaned lightly against the footboard, her fingers brushing the worn strap of her bag. The scent of herbs still lingered faintly in the air, clean and grounding, a quiet counterpoint to the sterile sharpness of the machines. It reminded her of home in a way that ached. Hazel's face rose unbidden in her mind, her sister's determined smile when she insisted she was fine, when they both knew she wasn't. Vivian swallowed hard. She had crossed a line tonight that could never be erased. Whatever happened next, she would carry this moment with her forever. Cassian sensed her withdrawal, the way her gaze drifted inward as though bracing for something unseen. "You should sit," he said quietly. The suggestion surprised her. She looked up, meeting his eyes, and saw concern there, not command, not obligation. Concern. "I'm all right," she replied, though her legs betrayed her with a faint tremor. Cassian didn't argue. He reached for a chair and set it near the bed, the gesture simple and strangely intimate. Vivian hesitated, then accepted, lowering herself with a controlled breath. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room existed in a suspended state, balanced between what had almost happened and what might still unfold. Moore broke the silence at last. "Stability doesn't equal recovery," she said, her voice measured but edged with warning. "This could reverse." Vivian nodded. "I know," she said softly. "That's why we don't rush." The calm certainty in her response unsettled more than defiance ever could. Cassian watched the exchange with sharpened awareness. He realized then that this was no longer a contest of methods. It was a clash of philosophies: control versus trust, intervention versus restraint. And he knew, without doubt, which side he stood on. Another hour passed. The sky beyond the windows began to pale, the first hint of dawn dissolving the darkness. With it came a subtle change. Margaret's breathing deepened, the shallow rasp easing into something closer to natural rhythm. A doctor stepped closer to the monitor, eyes widening slightly. "Heart rate's normalizing," he said. "Doctor?" Moore stiffened, disbelief flickering across her features. Cassian felt a rush of emotion so fierce it nearly unbalanced him. He pressed his lips together, steadying himself, unwilling to shatter the fragile calm with relief too loud. Vivian closed her eyes briefly, releasing a breath she had been holding since she arrived. This was the moment she had hoped for, but refused to expect. Her body sagged with exhaustion, but beneath it flowed a quiet triumph, not pride, but gratitude. Against odds and judgment, life had chosen to stay. Cassian turned to her, his voice low. "You did this." Vivian shook her head gently. "She did." She replied, "I just listened." The humility in her answer struck him deeply. In a world built on power and dominance, this girl wielded neither, yet she had changed everything. As dawn finally broke, pale light spilling into the room, Cassian understood that the night had not only threatened to take his mother, it had dismantled the walls he had spent his life building. And in the quiet aftermath, as Margaret Blackwood slept and the house exhaled its first breath of morning, Cassian found himself watching Vivian with a question he had never asked before. Not who she was, or what she wanted, but how someone so unassuming could become the axis upon which his world now turned. Morning arrived without ceremony. No sunlight spilled dramatically across the floor. No triumphant announcement marked the turning of the hour. Dawn simply crept in through the open windows, pale and cautious, as if unsure it was welcome after the night they had endured. Vivian noticed it first, not because she was watching the sky, but because the cold felt different. Less hostile, more forgiving. The bedroom no longer felt like a battlefield suspended between life and death, but like a place that had survived something terrible and was slowly remembering how to exist again. Margaret Blackwood slept, her breathing deep and even, the color in her face no longer borrowed from fear. The machines murmured softly now, their rhythm no longer sharp enough to cut. Around the room, the tension loosened its grip in subtle ways, shoulders lowering, voices softening, movements slowing. Cassian remained by the bed, exhaustion etched into every line of his body, yet something in him had shifted. He no longer stood like a man bracing for impact. He stood like someone who had stepped back from the edge and realized the ground beneath his feet still held. He watched his mother sleep, committing the sight to memory as if afraid it might vanish the moment he looked away. Across the room, Dr. Moore conferred quietly with two other physicians, her voice clipped, professional, but stripped of the sharp authority it had carried hours earlier. The verdict she finally spoke was careful, reluctant, and undeniable. "She's out of immediate danger," she said. The words echoed through the space, heavy with consequence. Vivian felt her chest tighten, as if something inside her had finally released its hold. She leaned against the footboard, her legs weak now that they no longer had fear to prop them up. Out of immediate danger did not mean safe. It did not mean healed. But it meant alive. And sometimes, that was everything. Cassian turned toward her slowly. There was no triumph in his expression, no relief loud enough to spill over. What lived in his eyes was quieter and far more dangerous gratitude edged with something like awe. He crossed the room, stopping a careful distance away, as if afraid to crowd her. "You stayed," he said softly. Vivian lifted her gaze. "So did you." The simplicity of the exchange carried more weight than any declaration could have. For a moment, they stood suspended in that shared understanding, the world narrowing to the space between them. Cassian noticed the way exhaustion had settled into her posture, the faint tremor she tried to hide by clasping her hands together. He realized then that she had been holding herself upright, through nothing but will. "You should rest," he said. Vivian almost laughed at that. "I will," she replied, "once I know she's truly stable." Dr. Moore cleared her throat from across the room, interrupting the fragile intimacy. "We'll continue monitoring," she said. "There will be tests, explanations." Her gaze flicked to Vivian. "Unreadable. But your assessment appears to have been correct. It was not an apology. It was not praise. It was acknowledgement. And in that moment, it was enough." Vivian nodded once, accepting it without satisfaction. This was never about being right. Cassian watched the exchange carefully, something hard and protective settling into his chest. He understood now that Vivian did not seek validation, did not crave recognition. She acted because she could not do otherwise. That knowledge unsettled him more than ambition ever had. A nurse approached quietly, lowering her voice. "She asked for you," she murmured to Cassian. "When she wakes." Cassian's breath caught. He glanced back at his mother, emotion rising unbidden. "Thank you," he said, then hesitated. He turned to Vivian again, his voice lowered. "Stay," he asked. It was not an order. It was not even a request born of power. It was something raw, a hope he did not know how to articulate. Vivian considered him for a moment, really looked at him now that the crisis no longer blurred the edges. Beneath the tailored suit and controlled presence stood a man who had nearly lost the one person he could not replace. She nodded. "I will." Margaret stirred an hour later, her eyes fluttering open with fragile confusion. Cassian moved instantly to her side, clasping her hand. "I'm here," he whispered, his voice breaking despite his effort to contain it. Margaret's gaze drifted, unfocused, then settled on Vivian standing quietly near the window. "Who is she?" she murmured, her voice weak but curious. Cassian hesitated, then answered simply, "Someone who helped." Margaret studied Vivian with surprising clarity, a faint smile touching her lips. "Then, thank you," she said softly, as if the words cost her precious energy. Vivian felt tears prick at her eyes and looked away, overwhelmed by the weight of that gratitude. She had not come here for thanks. but receiving it from the woman whose life had balanced so precariously in her hands left her undone in ways she had not anticipated. As the room settled back into routine, doctors checking charts, nurses adjusting blankets, Vivian became acutely aware of herself again. Of the world waiting outside these walls, Hazel, work, consequences yet unseen. Cassian noticed the shift immediately. "You're thinking about leaving," he said quietly. Vivian nodded. "I don't belong here." Cassian did not contradict her. He only said, "You changed what here means." The words lingered between them, unfinished, unresolved. Vivian picked up her bag slowly, the familiar weight grounding her. She took one last look at Margaret sleeping peacefully, then turned toward the door. Cassian watched her go, an unfamiliar sensation settling in his chest, something like loss, sharp and premature. As Vivian stepped into the hallway, the house behind her no longer felt like a fortress she had invaded. It felt like a threshold. And Cassian, standing in the room she had saved, understood with startling clarity that the night had taken more from him than fear, and given him something far more dangerous in return, a connection he could neither control nor forget. Vivian did not leave the Blackwood estate immediately. The house seemed to resist her departure, stretching the moment thin as she moved through its long corridors, each step echoing softly against marble floors that no longer felt as cold as they had hours before. Dawn had fully arrived now, pale light spilling through tall windows and revealing the quiet aftermath of the night's upheaval. Staff members moved with subdued efficiency, voices hushed, glances lingering on her with a mixture of curiosity and something like reverence. She kept her head down, clutching her canvas bag as though it were a shield. The world beyond these walls waited for her, unchanged and unforgiving, and she needed to return before this place reshaped her into someone she no longer recognized. Cassian remained in the bedroom with his mother, watching the steady rhythm of her breathing, but his attention fractured the moment Vivian stepped into the hallway. He felt the absence instantly, a hollowing sensation that surprised him with its sharpness. He had lived his life surrounded by people who came and went at his command. Yet this departure felt different. It was not loss born of power slipping away. It was the loss of something freely given, something he had not known he needed until it stood on the brink of disappearing. He followed her, stopping a respectful distance behind, as though afraid that speaking might break the fragile thread still connecting them. "You don't owe us anything," he said quietly. Vivian paused. She turned to face him, her expression composed but tired in a way that spoke of nights without rest and lives lived on the edge of endurance. "I know," she replied. "That's why I'm leaving." The honesty of her answer disarmed him. Cassian searched her face, finding no resentment there, no expectation, only a quiet resolve that made his chest tighten. "At least let me make sure you get home safely," he offered. Vivian shook her head gently. "I've been getting myself home my whole life." The words were not a challenge. They were a statement of fact. Cassian accepted them with a nod, though the instinct to protect lingered stubbornly. They reached the front door together. The iron gates beyond stood open now, welcoming in the morning air. Vivian stepped out into the cold, the city's distant hum seeping back into her awareness. She mounted her bicycle, the familiarity grounding her after the strangeness of the night. Cassian watched her go, committing the image to memory, the slight curve of her shoulders, the determination in the way she pedaled away without looking back. The gates closed behind her with a muted finality that echoed through him. Vivian rode until the estate disappeared from view, until the streets narrowed and the city reclaimed her. Only then did she allow herself to slow, the weight of exhaustion crashing down all at once. Her hands trembled as she stopped at a corner, resting her forehead briefly against the handlebars. She had crossed a line that could not be erased. She had stood in a world that was never meant to include her and changed it, however briefly. The thought was both empowering and terrifying. Hazel's face filled her mind, the promise Vivian had made silently the night before to keep going no matter the cost. She pushed herself forward again, toward the life waiting for her. Back at the estate. The house settled into a strange stillness. Cassian returned to his mother's side, taking in the peacefulness of her sleep with a gratitude so deep it bordered on pain. Margaret stirred slightly, her eyes opening with more clarity than before. "You look tired," she murmured, Cassian smiled faintly. You scared us. Her gaze sharpened, understanding flickering behind it. The girl, she said. She saved me. Cassian nodded. Yes. Margaret's hand tightened weakly around his. Then don't let her disappear. The words struck him with quiet force. He had been raised to control outcomes, to bend circumstances until they aligned with his will. Yet something told him that chasing Vivian, pulling her back into this world with promises or power, would only push her further away. I won't, he said, though he wasn't entirely sure what that meant yet. He would find another way. Hours passed. The doctors confirmed Margaret's continued stability, their skepticism giving way to cautious acceptance. Dr. Moore remained distant, her pride wounded but her professionalism intact. She avoided Vivian's name altogether, referring to her only as the variable. But Cassian noticed the shift in her demeanor, the subtle acknowledgement that something beyond her control had occurred. It was a crack in a system that prided itself on certainty. By afternoon, the estate felt almost ordinary again, as if the night's drama had been absorbed into its walls and silenced. Cassian retreated to his study, the quiet pressing in around him. He found himself replaying moments he could not explain: the steadiness of Vivian's hands, the clarity in her eyes, the way she had spoken to him not as a titan or savior, but as a man in pain. He realized then that her departure had left more than empty space behind. It had left questions. Across the city, Vivian reached her apartment just as the sun climbed higher. Hazel was asleep on the couch, a blanket pulled up to her chin, her breathing shallow but even. Relief flooded Vivian as she knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her sister's forehead. I'm here, she whispered. Hazel stirred, smiling faintly. You look like you didn't sleep at all. Vivian laughed softly, the sound brittle but real. Something like that. She didn't speak of the estate, or the woman she had saved, or the man whose world had brushed so close to hers. Some things needed time to settle. She only knew this whatever line she had crossed that night. It had not been erased by leaving. It followed her still, quiet and persistent, like a promise waiting to be tested. And somewhere across the city, Cassian Blackwood sat in a room too large for one man, realizing that the girl who had walked away had taken with her a piece of the silence he could no longer live without. The days that followed moved with deceptive calm. Vivian returned to her routine as if the night at the Blackwood estate had been a fever dream she could outwork and forget. She delivered packages, scrubbed counters, counted coins at the kitchen table long after Hazel had fallen asleep. Yet the silence left behind by that night followed her everywhere. It lingered in the pauses between breaths, in the way her thoughts drifted toward a man she had known for only hours and felt she understood too well. Hazel's condition worsened quietly, cruelly, the way storms gather without sound. The surgery date loomed closer with every appointment, the cost still impossibly distant. Vivian refused to hope for miracles. She had learned the danger of that long ago. Across the city, Cassian watched the same days unfold with an entirely different weight. His mother recovered steadily, her strength returning in measured increments. But the house felt altered, as though something essential had been rearranged. He found himself listening for footsteps that never came, expecting a presence that had no reason to return. He kept his distance deliberately, resisting the urge to summon Vivian with money or promises. Whatever bound them had not been forged by obligation. It could not be claimed that way. Instead, he worked quietly. Phone calls were made, files were reviewed, anonymous arrangements set into motion with the precision he had perfected over a lifetime. He told himself it was practicality, nothing more. He told himself many things that did not quite ring true. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. Vivian stood in a hospital corridor, her hand braced against the wall as the doctor spoke words she had prepared herself to hear and still could not absorb. We can move the surgery up, he said. The funding has been secured. Her heart lurched. By who, she asked, already knowing the answer she feared. The doctor shrugged gently. A donor who requested privacy. Vivian left the hospital in a daze, the city blurring around her as realization took hold. Gratitude warred with anger, relief tangling painfully with pride. She rode until her legs burned, until she found herself standing before the Blackwood estate once more. the gates open as if they had been expecting her all along. Cassian was waiting in the garden, coat discarded, sleeves rolled back, his posture relaxed in a way she had not seen before. When he turned and saw her, something softened in his expression, something unguarded. "You didn't have to do this," Vivian said, the words sharper than she intended. Cassian met her gaze evenly. "I didn't do it for gratitude." "Then why?" The question hung between them, fragile and dangerous. Cassian considered her carefully, the truth pressing against his restraint. "Because I saw what it costs you to care," he said quietly. "And because some debts aren't meant to be repaid with silence." Vivian shook her head, emotion tightening her throat. "You can't fix my life." Cassian stepped closer, stopping just short of touching her. "I'm not trying to," he said. "I'm trying to walk beside you. If you'll let me." The honesty of the admission left her breathless. This was not an offer of rescue, not a transaction dressed as kindness. It was a choice, one that required her consent. Vivian thought of Hazel's smile, of the long nights spent holding fear at bay, of the strength she had built brick by brick without anyone's permission. She thought of the man standing before her, who had watched her leave without chasing, who had helped without demanding credit. "I won't belong to your world," she said. Cassian nodded. "I wouldn't ask you to. And I won't be your miracle," she added softly. His lips curved faintly. "You already were," he said. Silence settled, heavy but no longer hostile. Vivian felt something inside her loosen, the fear that accepting help would erase her independence. She realized then that strength did not vanish when shared. Sometimes it multiplied. Hazel's surgery was scheduled for the following week. Vivian stood by her sister's bed that night, whispering reassurances she finally believed. Across the city, Cassian sat with his mother, listening as she spoke of chances rarely given twice. "She changed you," Margaret observed gently. Cassian did not deny it. "She reminded me what matters," he replied. The night before the surgery, Vivian and Cassian met again, not at the estate, but at a quiet cafe where no one knew their names. They talked not of wealth or power, but of small things, favorite seasons, memories that still ached, hopes spoken carefully, as if they might break. When they parted, there were no promises, only an understanding forged in honesty. The morning of the surgery arrived with relentless clarity. Vivian held Hazel's hand as they wheeled her away, fear pressing close but no longer overwhelming. Cassian waited in the corridor, a presence both steady and unobtrusive. Hours later, when the surgeon finally emerged with a tired smile and the word "successful," Vivian's knees gave out. Cassian caught her without hesitation, holding her as she cried into his shoulder, the sound raw and unrestrained. In that moment, there was no divide between their worlds, only two people standing in the aftermath of something survived. As Hazel slept peacefully in recovery and the sun dipped toward evening, Vivian looked at Cassian through tear-bright eyes. "This doesn't mean I owe you," she said. Cassian brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch light, respectful. "It means we chose each other," he replied. And in that choice, deliberate and unforced, they stood on the threshold of something new, no longer bound by fear or circumstance, but by a truth strong enough to carry them forward into whatever came next. The hospital smelled different in the evening, less antiseptic, more human. The frantic energy that had filled the corridors hours earlier had softened into something quieter, almost reverent. Hazel slept in her recovery room, color returning slowly to her cheeks, her chest rising and falling in a rhythm Vivian had imagined 1,000 times but never dared to trust. Vivian sat beside the bed, one hand wrapped gently around her sister's fingers, afraid that if she let go, the moment might unravel. Cassian stood a few steps back, giving her space, watching with an expression that held no claim, no expectation, only presence. It struck Vivian then how deliberate he had been about that from the beginning. He had never tried to pull her into his world by force or gratitude. He had simply stayed when she needed someone to stay. Hazel stirred, her lashes fluttering open. "Did I make it?" she whispered, her voice thin but steady. Vivian laughed softly through tears. "You did," she said. "You were very brave." Hazel's gaze drifted past her, landing on Cassian with quiet curiosity. "Is he the reason?" she asked. Vivian hesitated, then smiled. "He helped," she said. Hazel considered this, then nodded once, satisfied. "Tell him, thank you for me," she murmured before drifting back to sleep. Cassian felt something tighten in his chest, a warmth unfamiliar and grounding. Later, they stepped outside into the cool night air, the city humming softly around them. Vivian leaned against the railing, exhaustion finally catching up to her now that fear no longer held her upright. Cassian stood beside her, close enough to feel, far enough to respect. "You don't have to stay," she said quietly. "I want to," he replied. The simplicity of it made her smile. They spoke then, not of rescue or debt, but of futures once considered impossible. Vivian talked about finishing school, about opening a small clinic one day where people like her grandmother had once helped neighbors when no one else would. Cassian listened, not interrupting, not offering solutions, only asking questions that showed he was truly hearing her. In turn, he spoke of stepping back from the life that had demanded everything and given little in return, of choosing influence over control, of learning how to exist without armor. The words came slowly, unpracticed, but honest. "I don't know what we'll look like," Vivian said at last. "I just know I won't disappear into anyone else's shadow." Cassian met her gaze, his voice steady. "I don't want you to—" Silence settled comfortably between them, no longer weighted with uncertainty. Over the weeks that followed, life reshaped itself in quiet, meaningful ways. Hazel recovered quickly, her laughter returning to the apartment Vivian had once feared would hold only echoes. Vivian reduced her shifts, finally allowing herself rest without guilt. Cassian visited often, never announced, always respectful of boundaries. He learned the rhythm of their world, how mornings began with tea and sunlight through thin curtains, how evenings ended with shared stories and unremarkable joys that felt anything but small. Margaret Blackwood recovered fully, her gratitude deep and unassuming. When she met Vivian again, she took her hands gently and said, "You saved more than my life." Vivian understood what she meant. Cassian and Vivian chose their relationship deliberately, without spectacle. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping promises made to impress. Instead, there were conversations that stretched late into the night, disagreements handled with care, silences that felt safe rather than threatening. Cassian never tried to erase the distance between their worlds. He built bridges instead, sturdy enough to walk across together. One evening, months later, they stood in the same garden where Vivian had once confronted him in anger and fear. The city lights flickered beyond the gates, and winter gave way to early spring. Cassian took Vivian's hand, not as a claim, but as a question she answered willingly. "I don't need saving," she said softly. Cassian smiled, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "Neither do I." The truth of it settled between them, profound in its simplicity. They were not a miracle story. They were not a tale of a poor girl rescued by power, nor a man redeemed by love alone. They were two people who had chosen each other without erasing themselves, who had learned that strength could be shared without being diminished. As they walked back toward the open gate, side by side, the past no longer felt like a chain. It felt like a foundation solid, unchanging, supporting the life they were building together. And for the first time, Vivian allowed herself to believe that happiness did not have to be borrowed or feared. It could be chosen, quietly and completely, every day.